Today we take a look at an Athletic article talking about a potential trade involving the Montreal Canadiens to find another right-shot experienced defenseman. They partner with the Edmonton Oilers and a few other teams that deals that do make a lot of sense, so we'll discuss some possibilities of what we might see transpire. Plus, we're also taking a look at some signings. We have Sam Gagner in Winnipeg. The Rangers have once again won the Jimmy Vesey sweepstakes on a PTO. Plus, we have news out of Ottawa regarding Nikita Zaitsev's future. All that and more coming up next. So welcome back to another video here at Top Shelf Hockey. As I mentioned, we have a variety of NHL news and some trade talk to take a look at here today. First up, we do have a signing in Winnipeg. The Winnipeg Jets have signed veteran center Sam Gagner to a one-year deal, $750,000. Pretty good depth signing for the Winnipeg Jets. There was a lot of talk earlier that Gagner would possibly end up in Toronto or Edmonton on a one-year deal. Same sort of thing. I thought Edmonton was probably a little bit more likely because it has been a rumor that the Oilers would like to add another forward, which we certainly something we're going to talk about again further into this video. As the Athletic article I mentioned that between the Habs and Oilers trade that we could see that does make some sense. It would involve them getting a forward as well. So Gagner was also kind of in that rumor mill about a forward who could end up with the Oilers. Obviously that doesn't happen. The Leafs obviously they're pretty deep at the forward group. So I thought that was less likely. And if he did end up there might be a chance he might end up playing for the Marlies, which I'm sure he probably wasn't overly fond of. But of course, he's from that area, really good friends with John Tavares. So there were some connections there, but certainly the Jets would be able to give him a better role, more playing time, and it should be a good fit from there. Now, the New York Rangers have once again won the Jimmy Vesey sweepstakes. Of course, that's a bit of a joke considering where things are at with Jimmy Vesey's career right now. He goes to the Rangers on a PTO. That's where things are at for Jimmy after being a college player that came out with a lot of hype around him. Obviously, was drafted by Nashville, got his rights traded to Buffalo, didn't sign with either, ended up going to the Rangers. They won the Jimmy Vesey sweepstakes. That's probably where he played some of his best hockey. Not that it was overly great, but he did have his best run there in the NHL. Has bounced around to numerous teams since then. Played for Toronto, Vancouver, New Jersey, and I think others too. And now he's back with the Rangers on a PTO. Now, they've got a pretty deep forward group, to be honest, so I'm not really sure what the odds are of VC cracking that lineup or getting a contract. But just getting to an NHL training camp on a PTO was better than not. I've seen some players go to camp with one team on a PTO, but actually get an offer from somebody else, depending on, scouts watching and depending on what they can get into some preseason games and things like that. So we'll see if VC can continue his NHL career or not, and if he can end up where he started, back with the New York Rangers. Now, also, I want to talk about Nikita Zaitsev's future with the Ottawa Senators. Of course, he's been a topic of a fair bit of discussion over the offseason in Ottawa as a player who is very, very likely to be leaving the organization. He's been rumored a lot in trades around the Senators trying to upgrade their blue line. He's been one of the main players talked about in a Jacob Chychrun trade. Of course, to get Chychrun, they would preferably like to shed some money, and it was believed that their conversations with the Coyotes were revolving around Zaitsev being included along with some other picks or prospects to kind of make it worthwhile for Arizona to do that. He still has a couple years left on that $4.5 million deal. Of course, it was a 7-year deal originally signed by the Leafs, which they not long after quickly realized it wasn't a good idea. They were able to shed that deal, I think, with 5 years left on it to the Senators in a big Ottawa-Toronto trade at the time. Of course, Ottawa, they were willing to take it. They were, lower in the standings at the time and, kind of wasn't such a big deal, but now that they're starting to improve and come out of this rebuild and want to compete more for playoffs, he's a liability back there. He just creates chaos, as Mark Mathot likes to say. And Pierre Dorion recently did an interview on TSN 1200 talking about a variety of things, but when he talked about the defense, there was really no mention of Zaitsev. It was crickets. There was nothing. His name never came up at all, and just kind of got people talking. I know Brent Wallace and Mark Mathot were talking about it on one of their recent shows and found that interesting. When Dorian was talking about like the top four, he referred to Shabbat, Zub, Holden, Hamonic, talked about Jake Sanderson getting in the mix, Eric Brandstrom, who they still need to sign. No mention of Zaitsev. So I don't know what the plan is here. I think it's fair to say that they're still actively trying to move him. Whether the Jake Chychrun trade materializes or not, he could maybe be moved in a separate deal. That is a possibility. Or I wonder if they're unable to move him. I wonder if they'll put him on waivers and demote him to the minors if he clears. That it was a possibility. I mean, they don't get the full cap relief that way, but you do get a little bit more than $1 million salary cap space and relief. I mean, they're not completely up against the cap, so they have a little bit of wiggle room anyway. They still need to sign Brandstrom. They still need to sign Alex Formenton. They probably could use some breathing room, but it's not, like some teams where they're like, extremely tight, fighting for every dollar. But, Zaitsev contract is becoming more of a burden that way. And they do need to move on from it, and to add a player like Chychrun, it's a guarantee that contract has to go in order to make anything like that work. If they want to upgrade their blue line, not only does Zaitsev need to go because there's better players who can play in his spot, but his contract needs to be moved so that they have the financial flexibility to make it happen. It's just that simple. It's just really interesting that there was no mention of him at all, where he technically is with the team. He's on the roster. I think, patience have run thin in Ottawa on Zaitsev play. I know the fan base is ready for him to go and have been for some time. He works hard, seems like a good guy, but he's just not cutting it back there. Creates way too many mistakes. He has been paired with Chabot for a long time, which a lot of people think he's holding him back. Chabot definitely needs more of a stabilizer defenseman, and Zaitsev is just not that. Like, he needs, like what Mark Mathot was to Erik Karlsson in their heyday. They were one of the great pairs because they complemented each other extremely well, and Chabot could benefit from somebody like that, which Artem Zub was a much better type of defenseman that fits Chabot's style to be the partner way better. So if they can play together, that would only be great for the team and for Chabot both. And it sounds like Zaitsev's days are numbered, just a matter of how they're going to go about things, if a trade materializes, or could he even go to the minors if need be. Now, as I mentioned as well, I want to take a look at an article in The Athletic written around the Montreal Canadiens and author Marc-Antoine Gaudin talking about how the Habs really do need to add a right-shot defenseman, preferably somebody with some experience. After the departure of Jeff Petrie, they did get Mike Matheson in that trade, so they still get some experienced D-man to come in. But, of course, he plays on the left side. That leaves David Savard and Chris Weidman as your two main experienced guys on the right side, and it's just not really... David Savard last year was not overly good. Chris Weidman is really not much more than a third pair guy who can kind of chip in a little bit offensively. They could really use somebody back there who could play more of a an experienced puck-moving type of role. And obviously they have some young guys like Barron and Harris, etc., Caden Gooley. They don't want to have too many young defensemen come into their lineup at one time. They probably rather ease them in, take the pressure off, and have some vets around for another year or two as they kind of get their feet wet and kind of prepare for more of a full-time permanent role. So obviously, right now they do have a little bit of wiggle room, even though the show is being way over the cap. That's because of obviously Carey Price not being able to play this year. They can place him on long-term injury reserve. That'll make them cap compliant and give them around, I think it's $3.5 to $4 million. It's less than 4. It's like 3 something that they can still go over the cap because with his contract and be fine. That's of course assuming that Jonathan Drouin and Sean Monahan, who are on capfriendly.com still listed as IR, are able to start the season. I believe Drouin will be. Monahan is expected to be, but it could be delayed a little bit. But even if he is delayed, it won't be by a lot, I don't think. So they really can't use that space for too long anyway. But essentially this article goes on to mention a few teams that Montreal could be great partners with. So even though they have the space, they could theoretically take on a contract. But here's the thing, they still need to sign Kirby Dach. And if you think about the rumors that have been out around Dach lately, suggest that the Habs and Dach's camp are looking at either a 3 or 4 year contract. It's not going to be a long-term deal. 4 years does take him right to unrestricted free agency. He'd be a young UFA, but it is something a lot of players have been kind of fighting for in their negotiations. I mean, a 3 year deal keeps him as an RFA with arbitration rights, with 1 year being away from UFA status. But you're looking at a 3 or 4 year deal, probably in that $3.5 million range, something like that is approximately what Dach's looking at. So majority of, or if not all of that space that is remaining that they can exceed the cap by with their LTIR room is basically gone. So to make any additions, they need money to go out. And then, of course, there's the other complicating factor here is that they have 14 NHL forwards already. That's not even counting first overall pick Yuri Slafkovsky. Now, Slafkovsky, I believe based on comments from Gorton and Hughes, it sounds like they want to at least give him the sample size, like, some games early on to see if he'll stick or not. I mean, I think they won't be afraid to send him to Laval if they feel he needs it. If the team is going to be struggling this year and having another down year, depending on where he's at, it may or may not be best for him to be there. Only time will tell once you get through training camp. It's a little early to answer that question. But counting Slafkovsky, they have 15 forwards. So that's more than enough. That's assuming everybody's healthy. So, I mean, they've added guys throughout the year. Like, they've added Dadonov, they added Monahan. Jerard, who missed a lot of time last year, is healthy now. Byron's coming back. They've got a lot of guys here, right? So, some players that are very likely going to be dealt. Hoffman is right at the top of that list. Dvorak's at the top of that list, and Armia as well. Maybe Durant, but I think Durant and Dvorak, in Dvorak's case too, I think Dvorak's going to need a little bit more time to kind of rehabilitate his value. Last year wasn't exactly kind to him. Jonathan Drouin has missed so much time in the last couple of years. I think he'll need to show, that he can play it still as well before teams will be interested in him too. Of course, Drouin's got 1 year left on his contract. It's a big year for him. To continue his NHL career and get his next contract at a decent level, he's going to have an important season here where he can produce. And it might lead to a trade later into the year perhaps if he's showing that, he's got some value and teams are interested. Like I said, for Dvorak, I do think that they are interested in moving him. They've had conversations reportedly around him, but it might take a little bit more time before teams are ready to pull the trigger on that. Right now, the offers would be low. You're looking at probably a 3rd round pick. Players like Dadonov and Monahan were just picked up, and they may or may not be there for the whole season. It really depends. I think in the case of Dadonov, there's a good chance he could play. And then maybe be a deadline move. In the case of Monahan, based on how they were talking about him when he was first acquired, I think it's going to depend on how things go. But if he can get anywhere close to being the old Sean Monahan, I wouldn't be shocked if they try to keep him and extend him, but they could consider moving him at the deadline as well. Same goes for veteran Paul Byron, who's been there quite a while, battled a lot of injuries in the last few years, so it's hard to say what his value is going to be. But they're all players that may start or may not end the season in the Habs organization this year. I think the 2 most likely guys that would be interested to, like a team like the Oilers, would be Hoffman or Armia. And Hoffman, to me, makes more sense. The contract term is the same as Tyson Barrie. The money is not identical, but it's almost identical. It's money in, money out on both sides. It's 1 for 1. You got a puck-moving defenseman, and you got a goal-scoring winger on the other side. To me, if the Oilers and the Habs wanted to hook up on a trade, that makes a ton of sense. I mean, obviously, I think it's an easy deal to make. Barrie could essentially be a replacement for the next year or two for Jeff Petrie, while some of the younger defensemen are continuing to develop. Hoffman can go to Edmonton, play a top 9 role, and be able to continue, hopefully, being that scorer he's been for most of his career. Now, a couple other teams that this article mentions that does make some sense as well. The Winnipeg Jets might also be a good landing spot for Montreal to get a defenseman from. For example, Dylan DeMello might be available in Winnipeg, although their blue line's not the deepest, but they might be willing to move DeMello for a guy like Hoffman as well. So that's another trade that's mentioned that does kind of make some sense. Also, the Carolina Hurricanes have a plethora of defensemen. They have a deep blue line. They have several, basically you can call them extras, but they have I think 5 right shot defensemen on their roster. So obviously not everybody can get in the lineup at one time. You might have to play your weak side or whatnot. So the Canes might be a partner to look at as well. Depends on who the Habs would really want from there versus who they might be willing to move. I'm not sure if one really comes to mind as being a great fit. But we know the Hurricanes certainly lost a few players. That their forward group's a little bit different. And they got Pacioretty, of course, who came in, which is great. But at the same time, he's going to be out now for a chunk of time. A guy like Hoffman or even Armia, because they have a lot of Finnish players that he would probably fit in well with, might be another spot that would make sense for them. So one of those 3 teams would be a great team for the Montreal Canadiens to be trade partners with. I think there's lots of things there that make sense. Obviously, like I said, the biggest one that's probably the easiest, though, would be like a Barrie for Hoffman deal between Montreal and Edmonton, considering the money is so close for both teams. It would be an easy in and out and could help both sides. So let me know your thoughts on that down in the comments, as well as the other items discussed here today down, and we'll discuss further. If you're new to the channel, of course, make sure you subscribe and stick around. We'll keep you up to date with the latest news, rumors, and analysis on all 32 NHL teams. Thank you for watching, and I'll catch you next time.